cops and other law enforcement people of Reddit, what were some cases you worked on that made you think, even if for a moment, that something supernatural paranormal was going on? Here is my perceived woman story. Spoiler alert. As a result of posting this last time, users suggested she could have suffered from catatonic schizophrenia, was driving along and found a girl just standing in the middle of the road. My initial thoughts was to tell her to pay attention, but it was clear that while the lights were on, nobody was home. During my whole time with her, she never uttered a word. I was left in a weird situation. She had done nothing, clearly needed help, but medically nothing seemed wrong. As I am pondering what on earth I should do, the girl suddenly starts spinning. Now spinning is not illegal, and I'm starting to think this girl is one of those protesters that wind up police. I've dealt with Troll Station before, so I think crack on. Spin to your heart's content. Then she loses her balance and falls, whacking her head on the side of the police car. Great. So I call an ambulance, but she seems fine. Still not talking, but she is looking up at the sky. It's a nice day, so fine, enjoy the sun. I do some writing and look back at her now bright red face and watering eyes and realize she is trying to damage her retinas by forcing herself to look directly at the sun. That's a new one on me, so now I'm holding a book or something above her to shield her eyes. Ambulance arrives and we get to hospital, and now she has forgotten how to walk. Now I'm 99% sure she is a wind-up merchant, but I get her a wheelchair. In the wheelchair she strikes up I'm a little teapot pose and keeps this up for the next hour. Zero movement, just frozen with her arms out. So I now have 3 potential situations. 1. She is pretending to be frozen in time. 2. She is suffering from a mental health issue. 3. She has been possessed. By now I'm convinced it's the latter, but I section her and leave her with professionals. A week later I call the hospital and they tell me she is still frozen. I wonder if she's still in teapot mode to this day. My brother is a deputy, and at the time I worked as an EMT for a few small towns in northeast Colorado. I frequently went on ride-alongs with him while waiting for 9/11 calls to come in. This took place in Amherst, Colorado. The town is very small. Amherst has about 50 people, a church, some houses, a grain tower, and a park. It was about 3 AM and we were about to call it a night. As we were making our last check on Amherst, we noticed movement at the park but couldn't tell exactly what was going on because it was pitch black. We drove up and stopped alongside the dirt road, flipped on the spotlight, and as we moved the light around the park, it finally settled on the back of a young girl, maybe 13, sitting on a swing with her back facing us. We left the spotlight on her. She wasn't moving. She just sat there facing away from us, looking down at the ground. Needless to say, it was a very creepy situation. We both looked at each other with that face you would make when something is out of the ordinary. I quickly suggested that we should call her over using the PA system. He agreed. As we looked back over, she was gone. I mean, no signs of anyone anywhere. The park was in a wide open area. She couldn't have gotten out of sight in the amount of time that we had our exchange of words. I remember saying, should we get out and look for her? Maybe she hid behind one of the park toys or something. My brother just looked at me and said heck to the no and drove away. It still creeps me out to this day. Obligatory. Not my story but my uncle's. Years ago my uncle told us about a woman who would call the police station just about every night claiming that fairies or elves were breaking into her house and stealing her food. As is custom, every time she calls, they send a unit to check on her. My uncle gets it about 2-3 times per week. Every night they stop by her house and reassure her that no one has broken in and calm her down. One night when he gets to the house, she has poured powdered sugar all over the floor to record their tracks, and my uncle says he literally has to do a double take. All over the floor of her kitchen are these little tracks, tiny like nothing he's seen before. His partner starts taking photos and trying to figure it out. A few other officers come in, as most of them had gotten the call to her house too and want to see it. 10 police officers, all completely baffled as to what these weird little prints are. Turns out a possum had babies and they were sneaking into her kitchen for warmth or food. The prints looked so foreign because most of the time baby possums are carried by their mother, not running around. 7 are rounded up and released in a less residential area. Police officer working the desk 1500 2300. Fire alarm signal goes off. Many years ago the police department offered alarm monitoring service. Still had 10 12 places that were hardwired and it would require pulling apart a lot of equipment to disconnect the system, so we just kept it going. First shift dispatch is already punched in, so she took it. I'm headed out the door to the fire department when 911 rings from the same address. I answer it. No one in the other end. Assume they barely got to call before passing out. I bolt out the back door, hop in a squad car, radio in the 911 call on channel 3 that both police fire can hear and that I'm going directly to the house. Arrive just as another unit shows up. No signs of smoke. No sign of anything. Older woman comes walking up the street pushing a wheelchair with an elderly lady, her mother. They live there and just went out for an early evening stroll before dinner. Tell them what we have going on. Nobody else lives there, and as far as the elderly lady can remember, the alarm was disconnected from the house years ago during some renovations. They don't have any alarm system either, just a couple of smoke fire detectors. We do a walk around the house, get to the back door off the kitchen, and you can clearly see and smell gas. We turned off the gas at the main, set up some fans to air it out, and find a cracked gas line going to the oven. Daughter said she spilled some coffee she was making for their walk and had to move the oven a few inches to clean. Probably broke the line pushing the oven back in. Nothing else in the house is disturbed and both phones are on the hook. Fire chief shows up about 15 minutes into the call. He goes over to the two ladies and gives them both a hug. He's nearly in tears. The elderly lady in the wheelchair. Her husband was the fire chief 60 plus years ago for our department. The daughter. Her husband passed away a few years ago. He was also a member of our department. Never believed in ghosts or spirits, but that call made me think maybe people who spend their lives doing good are allowed by some power to look over their loved ones every so often. Crazy old woman called because she heard someone repeatedly banging on her front door and garage door. It's after midnight and I get there, and the house is in the middle of the woods with nothing around for miles. I talk to the lady and she insists I check her large shed out back. So I open the shed door and peek in with my flashlight, and the entire shed is filled with creepy large homemade dolls. They're each probably like 2 to 3 feet tall and sitting upright facing the door. The hair on my neck went up for a minute. I didn't truly believe that something supernatural was going on, but dolls are just really freaking creepy. It's probably too late for this to surface, but this is my dad's story. He went to a call where a father had gone crazy and decided to shoot his family. He killed his wife and was looking around trying to find his 5-year-old son to shoot him. The boy had run outside and was trying to hide on the side of the house behind the trash cans. The father eventually found him and point blank emptied nearly a full magazine at the boy. When my dad arrived, they found the boy in shock, hiding right where his dad found him. Not a wound on his body. There were bullet holes in the side of the house all around the boy. When they finally got to question him about it, they asked him what happened when his dad found him on the side of the yard. The boy replied, "The angel was in front of me with a shield, and he saved me. He pushed the gun away from me." I'm a second-generation firefighter. My father spent the latter days of his career as a fire safety director at a massive mental asylum. Our state version of OSHA has to come and do inspections at all facilities. His was no exception, so the OSHA inspectors make their way to an abandoned part of the facility that used to house the criminally insane, the absolute worst of the worst. Serial killers, rapists, cannibals, etc. My father left them with keys and a flashlight because the electricity didn't work. The inspectors were radioing back to my father that they kept hearing talking and footsteps, which was impossible. Not even squatters could move around because each section is isolated with locked doors to prevent escape. Eventually, the inspectors give up and actually flee without finishing. My dad decides to stick around and check the alarm boxes. They didn't. As he is checking one of the alarms, he feels as if someone is watching him from down the hall. As he looks, a shadow forms with a head, shoulders, torso but no legs and just 2 holes where there should be eyes. My dad noped the heck on out of there. Since the hospital has shut down, it has been on Ghost Adventures, Ghost Hunters and a myriad of other shows and movies. My dad has been in some of them. Jason from Ghost Hunters called it the scariest place he's ever investigated. Fire M's here. This is not my story. It happened on a different shift. Big Captain working overtime with us one day told it to us. and it creeped me out. The captain was on the first due engine company that was dispatched to a residential fire alarm in the middle of the night. Our dispatch protocols require us to send the first due unit emergency to a fire alarm, while the second due engine and ladder company respond routine. We go to tons of fire alarms and 99% of the time they are caused by a faulty system or burnt food, so we usually don't get too worked up over them. Anyways, as they approach the neighborhood they see the orange glow in the distance, and when they get on scene they find a 4,000 square foot house with heavy fire showing on the rear end that had already broken through the roof. The call was then upgraded to a working structure fire and more units were dispatched to assist. The captain of the first due stayed on the outside the whole time. He was incident commander until the 1st battalion chief arrived on scene and took over, and then he assumed the safety role. So, he's on the outside, in radio contact with crews that are inside fighting the fire. After the bulk of the fire had been extinguished and as operations were winding down, the captain sees smoke inside a second-story window and asks crews inside to go inside the room on the BC corner to make sure the fire hadn't spread to the other side of the house. The crews search for a few minutes and radio back. There's no room there, so the captain is a bit confused, as he is staring at what is clearly a window that is attached to a room of some sort. He relays detailed instructions of where the room should be to the crews inside, and they again advise that they can't find anything. Incredulous, the captain asks the incident commander for permission to go inside of the structure so he can show the interior crews exactly where the room in question is. His request is granted, and he goes inside, walks up the staircase, and walks towards the corner in question. There's no room there, just a hallway with a corner, no doorway, no window, no room. Knowing that there has to be something behind the wall, they breach the drywall and crawl through to find a child's bedroom. The bedroom had a dresser, a desk, and a perfectly made bed that looked as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. For whatever reason, the owners of the home decided to wall off the bedroom and leave it just as it was, untouched and inaccessible. The captain said it was one of the strangest and eeriest things he had seen in a while. Usually that means the child died and that couldn't deal with the grief of dealing with their things. Cop here. Partner and I were dispatched to a welfare check. Elderly guy. Nobody had seen him in a few days. Mail overflowing in mailbox. Missed a doctor's appointment. Car hasn't moved, etc. We both know we are about to find a body. We arrive on scene and can't get anyone to the door. Look through the window and sure enough, we can see his foot on the floor in the living room. My partner is a corporal and pulls rank and makes me go first. Door is unlocked and as soon as we open it we smell a mostly fresh dead body. Almost relieved, we both enter and he tells me to check vitals on dead dude. He is obviously dead, with lividity, dried feces on him and dried saliva around his mouth. So I go to stand over him and see if I can get a pulse, at which point he takes a deep breath, rolls over, and asks why we are in his house. At this point we both start screaming oh shoots and what the fricks as we both run out of the house. We called EMS and they transported him. Said they couldn't get a blood pressure or pulse on him. I think he died a week later in the hospital. I still get jokes about raising the dead. This is a good supernatural paranormal story rather than a creepy one. I'm a detective and spent some time as an expert on crimes and crimes against children. It was the best, worst assignment I've had. One case I had came in at midnight. A young woman with a toddler comes into one of the precincts to report her ex-boyfriend forced her during a custody argument. Long story short, it was legit, and one of the most violent and sadistic cases I've ever had, so I'll spare the gruesome details. I still have no idea how this woman made her own way to a precinct with a toddler. Part of the investigation requires me to talk to the toddler. Victim said the toddler was present for everything. I'm a child forensic interviewer as well. During the interview the toddler recalls their father becoming angry and hitting the mom. Then, the toddler said that the nice woman showed up and she couldn't see past the nice woman. The nice woman held her and told her that they were both going to be safe and sang her a song in a different language. The toddler said the nice woman went over to the front door and knocked on the door. Then, the nice woman helped them and their mom to the car before flying away. In the victim's interview, she said that her ex-boyfriend had a knife to her throat and put it to the skin to cut her throat open, but he got distracted for some reason then ran out of the apartment. She had no explanation why. The suspect was caught about 8 hours later. He confessed to absolutely everything. When I asked him about the knife to the throat, he said this: "I swear to God I was gonna cut the BS throat open. But I thought I heard a knock at the door and thought it was the police. Once I saw it was clear, I ran outside." He is now serving life in prison, and the mom and toddler are safe and doing well. I'd love to know more about the nice woman. Dang, that's the coolest sad thing I've ever read. Props to the nice woman. This was told by my dad when I was 12. Even now, when I ask him about the story, he can remember every vivid detail like it just happened last week. My dad was in the police force for 20 years, and when we just a rookie, he had to conduct nighttime roadblocks meant to catch drunk drivers. They had done it many times before, and this night started routine enough for them. That was until this Toyota Corolla drove up to them with what looked like a white blanket on its roof, flapping in the wind. They thought it was weird but did not see anything amiss about it. One of them even joked that this guy was multitasking by drying his laundry and driving home at the same time. The laugh stopped when the lone car came closer and all of them saw what looked like a woman in white lying face down on top of the car. The woman seemed to slide like a slug backwards until she disappeared behind the car as it eventually came to a stop in front of them. It took a few minutes for my dad's team to recompose themselves as they stared at each other as if to say, "You guys saw that right?" The most senior of them finally stepped up and shot the usual questions to the driver. There was a noticeable quiver in his voice as he made conversation and asked him to step out of the vehicle. My dad's team inspected the whole vehicle, including the boot, and found nothing strange in it. The driver was a good-looking staff sergeant in the army who was heading home from a company event earlier that night and admitted to have had a few cans of beer. He said he laid down in his bunk to sleep it off, hence why he was driving home at that time. It was 4 AM. He passed their sobriety test and they started to ask him if he saw anything weird during his drive. Initially he said no, but after more questioning, he mentioned that he had to swerve to avoid what looked like a bird that was flying upside down. It was spooky but didn't think that was a detail worth sharing with police officers. The senior then told the guy to chill out at a 24-hour coffee shop before heading home. The locals believe that if a malevolent spirit follows you, making a pit stop confuses them so they can't set up shop in your house. After some confusion of his own, the driver finally caught on and nodded in agreement. After the guy leaves, they call into the station and cut the night short. Never knew what happened to the driver, hope he's alright. Family member of a cop here. Where I grew up there is an abandoned factory that high school and college kids will visit, usually around Halloween, because it's scary enough in the dark. It also houses a decent amount of homeless people, so once every few months the cops will come in, do a sweep, and force anyone there to leave. One night my uncle is working and there's a call to the non-emergency line saying there's a lot of movement at the building, that the caller can see light on every floor but the first. My uncle and a few other officers respond. No more than 10 minutes have gone by when my uncle gets there. There's no one around, but there's plenty of light pouring out of the openings where the windows once were. The officers all agree it looks more like fire than flashlights, so they call the fire department as a precaution. They walk into the first floor and start searching for the stairs. They find them and ascend to the second floor. There's no light anywhere. Same with the third, fourth, fifth floors. They sweep the entire building, every nook and cranny, even the roof. There's no light source and no one there that they can find. Fire had arrived shortly after they went in and they couldn't see anything from the outside other than the subtle glow of flashlights, which was faint. Nothing like what my uncle and the others had seen. But my uncle said that what was even more unsettling was that none of the homeless areas, which were usually comprised of piles of trash along with cardboard boxes and blankets, were there. Not that they didn't find any homeless people, but that there was no sign that anyone had been in there at all, ever. IQ nurse here. We had a patient that was dying. No family. Around 3 AM the guy started crying and asking why the little girl in the yellow dress was in the hospital. We assure him there is no little girl. He cries even more saying yes there is, she is at the foot of the bed. Kid you not, the man passed in the next few minutes. Myself and my pod partner blame the hallucination on the meds we were giving him to keep him comfortable. Next night, new patient in the room. She's completely alert and oriented. About 3 AM she hits her call light. She wants to know why the little girl in the yellow dress was outside her room. We told her it was just her imagination from being in a strange place. Not 5 minutes later the guy in the next room goes into full cardiac arrest and unfortunately we can't receive him. Of course we absolutely freak. 2 different nights. 2 different patients see the same thing. All followed by death. So this actually happened to a friend of mine who isn't the cop in this story but is the actually family. So this happened maybe about 5 years ago. My friend is in his mid-30s. He and his wife had a 7-month-old baby and a 5-year-old son. Wife was a stay-at-home mom and dad owned his own business and had a very flexible schedule. He would take his son to school in the morning, pick him up, etc. So it's about 11 AM they call the cops because they keep hearing a strange sound in the home, sound like feet or something, and though he was sure it was nothing he wanted to make sure. So he says the cop arrives and the first thing the cop says is, "Why isn't your son in school?" My friend is puzzled and says, "Huh?" The cop says, "Your boy is sitting outside on your lawn." My friend again looks at the cop strange, looks on the lawn and says, "Officer, my son is in school. I dropped him off this morning." The officer looks back, sees nothing and looks puzzled. At this moment my friend's cell phone rings and it's his son's school. Apparently he has had some sort of allergic reaction to some finger paints that had egg base or something in it, allergic to eggs, and became extremely swollen. Throat swollen and couldn't breathe, rushed to the hospital. The cops give them an escort to the hospital so they can fly through lights and all. Arrive at hospital and the son is doing fine, is stable, got the lil shot to help him and everything. The cop waits to see how the family is doing and wants to check on the kid. My friend is appreciative and lets the cop come up and he says that he had never seen a paler face in his life and he said the cop looked as if he had seen a ghost and said, "That's the kid I saw in your yard." My friend told me this, it creeped me the frick out. I didn't believe it but the wife co-signed the whole thing. TL. DR cop came to friend house investigating foot sounds. Cop saw a kid in the yard. My friend's son was in school. Friend gets call that son is in hospital for anaphylaxis. Cop goes to hospital, says the kid he saw in the yard was in fact my friend's kid. Police officers of Reddit, have you ever had an all units call? And if so, what happened? I was doing a ride along in college in a fairly small city in GA when we got an all available units call. The address came in, the lights and siren went on and we were hauling ass at about 120 mph across town. I had no idea where we were headed until we got there. The only thing the officer said to me was, "No matter what happens, stay in the fricking car. If you see anyone with a gun, call it out on the radio like this." Showed me, if any of us get shot, call it in and stay in the car. Then, he took a deep breath, calmly got out of the car, and took off at a sprint towards a 40-person melee in front of the only strip club in town. We were the first car there. Over the course of the next 30 seconds, officers arrived and kept coming until they outnumbered the people fighting. The officer I was riding with was completely on his own for a 10-second eternity and was able to rip about 10 people apart from fighting before backup arrived. It was the single bravest and most humbling thing I've ever seen with my own eyes. When it was all over, he got back in the car with 3 drunk and beaten up dudes in the back, turned to me and said, "So when you gonna sign up?" 25 years ago, smallish rural town. My dad is a beat cop on patrol. My cat brings in a live mouse and is playing with it in the kitchen and my mom is deathly afraid of rodents. So she calls dispatch and tells them my dad needs to come home. Dispatch gets on the line and tells my dad to switch to a secured line. There's an emergency at home. My dad's driving home to take care of the issue when all of the cops, probably like 4 of my small town on patrol, come with sirens and lights blazing on my house because all they heard was there was an emergency at my dad's house. My mother was mortified. "Dang it, Martha, you can't keep doing this." Years ago, friend of mine was a dispatcher for the county. He covered sheriff, EMS and fire communications, and also worked with communicating with other agencies as well. From the state troopers, he got some sort of text communication, not a phone text as was before that was a thing, and it referred to an accident with injuries at the intersection of I-40 and Business 85. Something along the lines of collision I-40 bus 85 injuries involved. The way it was abbreviated and written made him misread it. Instead of an accident at 85 Business, he thought there was a bus collision on I-40, with 85 people injured. He dispatched every dang fire truck and ambulance the county had. They show up and it's a 2-car wreck with minor injuries. LOL, that is unfortunate for him but hilarious imagining the holy crap moment he would have had from reading it. Former cop here. The all units call was basically a riot at a large nightclub in a very rough area of the neighboring city. Once things were finally calmed down and the dozen or so people were taken away and my boss wanted us all back in our city, I was amazed at not only how many cops showed up but from where, counties and towns I had never heard of before. I looked up a few at the end of shift and some came from an hour plus away. I'm shocked the fight went on long enough for them to drive an hour there. Fighting is freaking tiring. So, I interned at the local PD at a time when all stations received new radio devices. The new devices looked a bit like old cell phones and had a bright orange panic button on top. It was meant for situations where, for example, a single police officer was attacked and needed help. Pushing that button resulted in all communication on the standard channel 1 being turned to one-way communication only, so all units would listen to what's going on wherever the panic button was pressed, and an automatic all free units call. All other units had to switch to the much weaker channel 2 to communicate, but channel 2 only allowed one device to speak, so either dispatch or car 1 or car 2 etc. could talk, but not multiple people at the same time like on channel 1. To disable the panic mode, you had to push the bright orange button in a certain way. Think of holding it for 3 seconds followed by 4 quick pushes. It could not be done remotely. This happened in a rather large city where some police stations are closed at night, usually the ones in the suburbs where few calls come in. That night, an older PO closed down the remotest station in the suburbs and decided to shut off the radio devices. You guessed it, he pushed the panic button on top because he thought that's where the devices were to be turned on and off. Without realizing what he did, he locked the station and went home. Since it was the first day of using the new radio devices, quite a few officers were unsure how to turn to channel 2. Basically, all communication was blocked. Cue panic everywhere with frantic cell phone calls to dispatch, and dispatch trying to figure out who closed that station, and thus had one of the only keys to open it, so the panic mode could be disabled. This unintentional all units call turned into an actual no units can call, though quite a few units were busy trying to resolve the situation. Good intentions but horrendously poor execution on the radio maker's part. Former Royal Canadian Mounted Police here in a small tourist town was working on a regular mid-weekday shift when we received a dispatched call for a bomb threat in the industrial commercial sector of the town. We all went there, called in the bomb squad, the dogs, got people out of the area, and so on. We were doing roadside when we got another call that the local bank's silent alarm was turned on. Now, we are in Canada, in a tourist town. Things are usually relatively calm, but this was absolutely chaotic. We got the all unit call. They call our neighboring detachment to help. We all split and head to the bank. We arrive. Around 20 some patrol cars all around. There to see all bank employees bounded and gagged. Smoke everywhere from smoke bombs. We realize very quickly that the bomb threat was the diversion. We immediately got a bolo out to get the 3 males, identified by the bank staff, including a former bank employee. We get the bolo out to CPIC, got words to airports and border crossings. We managed to catch 2/3 of the guys. The last one flew back to his home country, was in Canada on a student visa. We remained on high alert for days after this, looking for the third guy. Canadian authorities worked with their colleagues from the other guy's country to get him extradited almost a year later. In the end, as I recall, about $130,000 were missing and never recovered. For most of us, it was the first time we had a bomb threatened or a robbery. First time we were guarding an area, expecting to be shot at from an unknown location. The robbers were reported to have AK-47 type looking weapons. Holy frick, that sounds like a movie, or an episode of Flashpoint, because, you know, Canada. Usually about once a month or so, we're taught that if you need backup, if shoot's hitting the fan, call it in and worry about how many people come later. A unit was on patrol 2 weeks ago and some guy just started shooting at him. All the unit got out was 34th Saint. 1033 I'm taking fire. 1033 being the code for send the cavalry officer in need of assistance. It all ended fine. We caught the guy, no injuries, but you better believe every officer in our area dropped what they were doing and went. Another recent one, a mini riot broke out at a candle vigil for a murder victim. An officer stepped in alone. Bad move. to stop the fight and started getting his ass handed to him. All he said was Potomac, 1033, but it worked. We came in, dispersed the crowd, and got out. The potentially deadly version of the company-wide reply all. I remember listening to an episode of This American Life where an officer accidentally locked himself in the back of his car when he went to take a nap. He left his radio in the front, so he called dispatch and was like, "Don't make this a big thing. Just send one unit to me," and then dispatch proceeded to call out the code for officer down, so then he heard a bunch of cars put on their sirens and raced at him. I got run over by someone fleeing the scene of an incident that they weren't involved in. He just got scared and apparently had a gun on him. I was out of my car talking to the person who called and my partner was trying to stop the person who was really called on, so he didn't even see me get hit. No one knew I got hit or where I was because my radio went flying. Luckily there was a lot of witnesses who called 911 and found my radio. I confused the dispatcher because I was in so much shock that I came over radio taking like I normally do, but I was bleeding badly from my head and broke my leg. I didn't feel the pain for about 2 hours. So I had that call come out because of me. I'm also pretty sure a policy got made because of me too. We had an all units call to one of our own stabbed. Everyone went heck for leather to get there, to find one of our guys on the floor with a stab wound to the stomach. We searched everywhere for the suspects and anyone matching descriptions were arrested. So turns out the officer did it to himself. He'd heard you couldn't be fired from work if you were injured in the line of duty. He was under investigation for a minor issue, not anything involving the public, just breach of procedure. I don't think I've ever been so disgusted with a colleague in my life. All the other all units calls I've been to have been genuine and luckily my colleagues unhurt. I almost called one myself when someone pulled out a sawn-off shotgun at me. Luckily that panned out okay. Happens all the time. Officer S. in a fight. Possible subject with a gun. Major traffic accident. It's not anything like the movies. If it's a big enough incident, all your available units are going to be going. I work as a police communicator at a local university. Usually an all units call is a fire alarm at one of the buildings. However, most of the time it's a false alarm and someone just burnt the popcorn at the lounge. One morning at work we were evacuated from a rather large office building, 50 plus floors, in NYC. Fire alarms went off on 3 floors because someone burned their popcorn in the microwave. That person will never live it down. Obligatory not a cop, but I once got a all unit called to my house. Backstory, my mom was dating a rimhead and everyone knew who he was, and our address. I was around 15 and one night he went off the rails and was beating the crap out of my mom. I got involved just in time to see him swing at my sister, who was 7 at the time. I ran for the phone and called it in. I got as far as the address when he grabbed me by the neck and threw me. Well, the dispatcher heard my garbled yelp and called it in as a possible homicide in progress. That combined with his reputation sent every single cop in the surrounding jurisdictions came flying our way. By the end of it I think there was 20 plus police officers at our house. I ended up hitting him with my mom's cast iron skillet to keep him there just as the first officer showed up. He was super cool about it and pretended he didn't see a thing. It was a terrible night and my mom was mad at me for months. But man, you don't frick with my little sister. We have calls almost daily that kind of meet this requirement. We have patrol sectors, each with a 2-man cruiser and a 1-man cruiser. The 2-man cars handle the high priority calls and the 1-man cars handle the more mundane stuff. So when a call comes in like shots fired, both sector cars go and usually other sector cars start radioing and that they are also responding. I do remember one night at midnight, which is shift change, we had a 2-man unit that shot a guy who pulled out a gun on them. You could hear gunshots over the radio and the car calling for help. The dispatcher kinda stumbled a bit, then said everybody go, everybody go. Was a military police officer on a rather large base. I was getting off shift and being transported back to my barracks by the guys coming on shift so I could check in my weapon. Suddenly we got a call for all units to respond to a section of base housing. A military wife was having an affair with another soldier while her husband was on deployment. Supposedly the husband was due to return soon, so she tried to break it off with the other guy. He responded by stabbing her several times. My team leader and I searched the tree line with our weapons drawn. Cause he's armed and it's dark outside, you know. I actually passed the guy with my team leader a few yards behind me and suddenly he comes out saying, "You're looking for me." It scared the crap out of me. My team leader covered him while I went in for the handcuffing, making sure that I had my knee firmly planted in between his shoulder blades and thoroughly covering his upper torso into the muddy terrain. Not sure what happened after that. He was taken to a holding cell by another squad and I got to go home. Ended up getting transferred from that base a few months later, but I know the wife survived the wounds. Too many examples. London riots. Unit attacked with a machete. Large group fighting with knives. Building fires. So on and so forth. Happened to my dad when he was stationed overseas. There was an airshow disaster in Germany and he was already there, so he was one of the first to respond. He struggles from it still. Fireworks and barbecues remind him of the smell of burning flesh that day. Police officers. What is the most expensive exotic car you have ever pulled over? What was the driver like? A story from my dad, who was a cop for 33 years. Did not have to pull the driver over, but a fun story all the same. He was stopped in his police car at a traffic light when a bright red Ferrari 355 pulls up beside him. He thinks the car is great and rolls down the window to tell the driver so, except he gets something slightly off on the identification of the car. He notices the horse and the logo and makes an assumption. Dad, hey, that's a beautiful car, sir. Driver, thanks. Dad, is that the new Mustang? Driver, with a sullen look, it's a Ferrari, TLDR. Cop mistakes the prancing stallion Ferrari logo with the Mustang logo. Ferrari driver sadness ensues. Your dad was a troll before the internet age. Prior use of security forces here. While on flightline patrol, one of our F-16s was taking off for a training mission, and the flight crew forgot to remove the wheel chocks. Noticing one was bound up in the landing gear, I activated my lights and he stopped. So, in essence, I pulled over a $15 million vehicle. Amish carriage. Their slow-moving vehicle sign had become detached and fallen off. I caught up to the man and his son rather quickly and initiated the traffic stop. They pulled over and waited on my approach. I put on my most intense, cold dong starring, 1000-yard, been doing this too long, gonna hate crime, yeah. I frick possible. When I made contact I said, "Do you have any idea how fast you were going?" We all three burst out laughing. Then I explained the reason for the stop and reattached their placard. The next day I had a loaf of the most amazing fricking bread ever waiting for me at dispatch. The Amish have rockin' bits. The Amish like to seal friendships in homemade goods. The Amish are metal as frick. This was great. I stopped a Tesla for no plates just after they just came out. Just gave a verbal warning. He'd been given bad advice by Tesla about how long he had to register it. After the stop I BS'd with him for a few minutes and he showed me the different features the car had. I have to say that I was impressed with the car. When he pulled away he got on it and was up to the 55-mile-per-hour speed limit very quickly and quietly. I just moved to Palo Alto and those suckers are everywhere. I haven't gotten tired of them yet. Still turn my head and slow down every time I walk by one. I pulled over a 2010 Mustang Shelby 500 last year. The kid driving it was cooperative considering he could have outran my 2001 Crown Victoria with no trouble but stopped anyways. But honestly I have more fun pulling over mopeds. Every single time I've pulled one over they were either drunk, had were wanted, or tried to fight me and or outrun me. So what is the most common kind of car pulled over? In my experience, nicer, faster cars are rarely the ones doing stupid, ignorant, dangerous crap. I always guessed it was because the driver cared more about their car. The most common combination of driver car that I see doing stupid crap is white woman and large SUV. As someone who spends her day taking auto insurance claims, I can validate this. Not a very exciting story, but back when I was a cop, about 10 years ago, I pulled over a Lambo with dealer plates. By pulled over it was already parked in front of a pizza place in a highland zone. I didn't think the driver would be in it, so before I approached, I kinda did what everyone else was doing, and just admired the car from behind. I hear the window open and walk over. Middle-aged guy, nice enough attitude, gives me that whole I know bit. He was the dealership owner and wanted to flash the car around at the beach and get a slice of pizza. I asked him if he would move it, since it was too close to the hydrant. He was happy to oblige, but not before flashing this really scummy smile and saying, "I couldn't help noticing you admiring it. Come by for a test drive. Our finance guys are wizards," or something like that. Kinda creepy. That was the last I saw of it. In Jose Canseco's book Juiced, he constantly be about how no one liked him because he was Cuban, how Mr. White Mark McGuire got all the breaks and he was not given the same level of leeway, including an arrest for having a gun in his car, without a permit, in a state that frowned on such things. Then he tells the story of the time he was doing 202 miles per hour in a brand new Lamborghini, got pulled over by Florida's highway patrol, and they promised not to even give him a ticket if they could have 5 minutes to check out the car. I've just got to say that Jose Canseco's AMA a few years ago was probably the best thing that ever happened on Reddit. I'm always fond of Jay Leno's story. He took a car of his up to a car show, and while there these two huge tatted gangbanger looking dudes started chatting him up about the car. Eventually it came to the point where Jay was getting along well enough with them that he offered to take them for a ride in it. So they're up in the mountains and he's going the speed limit like, "Hey, look at how fun this is," but one of the guys says, "Here, really give it some power. Let's see what it can do." And Jay does. He blows through a tunnel and as he exits he sees the blue and white. Cop pulls him over and he's panicking because he's like, "Oh god, I've got these two muscly gangbangers, they're gonna get me arrested, the car will probably be impounded. Blah blah blah." So the cop comes up to the window like, "Why the heck were you going so fast?" And the gangbangers pull out their badges and go, "It's okay, we're undercover PD." When I was in college, I drove this pretty crappy 4Runner, old, accelerated at the speed of taco. I mean, give me 3 hours and I could get it up to 80 miles per hour and the car would only threaten to shake itself to death in that 55-60 miles per hour range. After that, it was fine. Anyway, I was on the interstate going at an 80 mile per hour clip, in a 65 mile per hour zone. There's a Lamborghini right behind me, gunning it, so I go and switch lanes. In the middle of switching lanes, we pass the little authorized vehicles only road. Road? Not really a road, just the pathway that connects the two highways. And I see the popo. They cut on their lights and I'm screwed. I change lanes to pull over, but the cop just takes down the Lambo instead. Thank you, state trooper. I deserved a ticket as well, but you passed me by. Probably because you didn't want the possibly unsafe emissions from my vehicle getting in your face. I swear 4Runners secretly have a stealth mode switched to on. With some of the things I've done around cops I certainly should have been pulled over, but it seems they never notice. I was an officer in Australia for a good period. I pulled over a work 370Z doing over 207 kph in 2008. The driver was completely blind drunk. He had no clue we had been chasing him for 5 minutes. He was arrested and charged for negligent driving, high-range PCA and multiple other charges. He fought the case for over 9 months and received an 8-month suspended sentence. An ex-colleague informed me 2 years ago that he was killed by a drunk driver whilst crossing the road in suburban Sydney. An ex-colleague informed me 2 years ago that he was killed by a drunk driver whilst crossing the road in suburban Sydney. Tales from beyond the grave. Not a cop, but I have a cop story. I was the first few people who owned an Audi TT. While it isn't a supercar in any respect, it looked like one when it first came out. I was driving back from BC to Seattle and pretty much cruising at 80 miles per hour at 1 AM trying to get home. Cop pulls me over at Kirkland and says, "Nice car." He then proceeds to check out the car and even had me open the door so he can check out the interior. Then he says, "I know your car can handle speeds higher than what I pulled you over for, but let's keep it down to a speed that won't scare the other drivers into hitting you." He lets me go with a warning. For a split second I felt like I was driving a Ferrari. My good friend works for BMW, and he often gets to take cars from the dealership. Knowing that I like cars, he called me up when he got to BMW M6. Not the most expensive car, but it's a great car. He'd just finished telling me that it was worth about $280,000 retail. Australian prices are insane. And that it was registered today. It had like 35 kilometers on the clock. As I'm driving to his house there was a cop behind me who lit me up. My mate tells me, "Look, Car's been registered today. Tell them you bought it today, and it will look like you have, as the registration wouldn't have transferred. It's either that, or they call the dealership and say you were driving a car you weren't meant to. I tell them that I bought it today. How much did you pay for it? $280k. 280 exactly? No, there were some dollars and cents, but I'll let the accountant sort that out. About 15 minutes of them looking all over a brand new BMW. Bethel is a etc. I'm good to go. They asked did daddy pay for this for you etc. I just laughed and said I wish. TL. DR. I got to act like a C and get away with it. I'm no police officer, but I can provide a story in which they allowed my uncle to do something pretty awesome. A state police officer in NH once pulled over my uncle in his Lamborghini. This was years ago. He wasn't speeding. The cop just wanted to talk to him about it. There are many slow days on the New Hampshire highways. I'm quite sure of it. How fast have you gotten this thing up to? Nothing that fast. Maybe 100 miles per hour. I have to follow the speed limits you know. Oh well, we can fix that I think. The officer gives my uncle a card, tells him to call the station when he gets a minute and explain who you are and how I pulled you over. My uncle is now kind of worried he's in trouble. Officer assures him he is not. A day or two goes by and my uncle calls the station. I hear, no way, you can't be serious, coming out of the other room. A week later the stat is shut down a stretch of highway for a few miles and let him floor it. He got up into the 180s. After he was done he pulls over to the cops and they gave him a ticket as a joke. Ripped it up after they got a look at my uncle's confused face. Pretty cool statties. Pretty funny too. Teen and his friend tried to outrun me in his daddy's Corvette. He didn't know I had an old 1994 Caprice with a 5.7 liters V8. That crap was fast. Came around the corner and saw him trying to hide with the lights off in a driveway. Man, did I scare the crap out of him when I snuck up right behind his open window. I'm on the other end of this. I was pulled over in Wales while driving my Piaggio 850. A policeman pulled me over on a suspicion of drunk driving because I was going at 15 in a 30, but my car only has a 50cc engine and I was driving uphill so it can't go very fast. After I was breathalyzed, the policeman confessed that he only pulled me over so he could have a better look at the car. Just saying up front, not an officer anymore, but had this kid we had impounded 4 or 5 cars from. Spoiled brat but good to talk with. His dad was some engineer for NASCAR type stuff and all his cars were tricked out, sometimes beyond even being street legal, and he was constantly getting in trouble. Got report one morning that the night before there had been a big, old pickup that had been drag racing around at insane speeds but had gotten away. Well, about lunch I see kiddo and goose what? He is driving a beat up looking old Dodge truck. I'm talking body dents, some underskirt rust, the works. But something just sat wrong so I swung back. He was cheerful and friendly as always but dropped his head a bit when I asked him to open the hood. Massive, tricked out high performance engine like I had never seen before. They had used every inch of that engine compartment space to where it looked like something out of a freaking spaceship. I had no ground so just warned him I knew what he was driving now and to be careful. He got busted about 2 days later doing about 120 in a 55 from what I heard. I used to work across the street from a Mercedes dealer. I worked for BMW. A 16-year-old kid comes in with his parents to drive a SL65 AMG, a car that cost almost $200k and has close to $700 featuring LBS of TRQ. He gets about 5 feet before he guns it into traffic and gets crushed by a UPS truck. Supposedly his parents thought the car was too fast and dangerous. They buy him a CLK Black Series instead. I went and test drove an AMG Black Series CLK. It was lightly used and thus thoroughly depreciated, and even calmly driving while knowing what I was doing it ended up with a bit of wheel spin just slowly getting on the highway. Those cars can be insane. I've stopped a few expensive cars for going too fast. Normally the drivers are extremely polite, successful businessmen. I did have a strange one with a Lamborghini. After I stopped him and explained he was going too fast, he said sorry and was very polite, and I thought that was then end of it. However, he then went on a rant about how I was going to search him for drugs. He was black. I had to explain at great length that if there was no paraphernalia on display nor a smell of cannabis, then I would have no grounds or a reason to search him. He seemed pretty annoyed by this. If anything, I think he wanted to be searched so he could brag to his friends at the tennis club about how the police search him all the time. It was really strange. His girlfriend was at a loss, as was I. Not a cop, but I am security guard at a power plant, and I learned later that I stopped a Celine Mustang. One night I saw a car coming to the entrance at very high rate of speed, so I engaged the hydraulic barrier and the car hit the barrier at a high rate of speed. The car was completely crushed. The front of the car and the rear of the car were only 4 feet apart. The barrier is designed to stop a fully loaded semi-truck doing 100 miles per hour without budging. According to the police, the driver was some middle-aged professional who wanted to post a video of himself online stunt driving through the grounds of power plant and escaping. Yeah, that's a no-win scenario. Anyone with a modicum of security industry knowledge is going to know that power plant security is about as friendly to outsiders as Guantanamo Bay, and that is at a regular power plant. Those nuclear power plant guards are the kind of serious professionals that will absolutely kill you if you try and break into the facility. I once pulled over a DeLorean for going 18 miles per hour over the speed limit. I am also not a cop, but have a story to share, third hand, so take it for what it's worth. I was attending a showing of a private car collection, and the owner was talking about having dinner with Parnelli Jones earlier in the year, and Jones told this story. He was driving from Vegas back to wherever in California at the dead of night, doing 100 or so. Nothing for him, but still speeding. He is stopped by Nevada State Police, and as the trooper comes to the window, he is steaming mad and yells at him, "Who do you think you are, Parnelli Jones?" He responds by handing the trooper his license and saying, "Actually, I am." It turns out that Jones was this trooper's favorite driver while growing up, so it was his fallback when berating drivers for speeding. The trooper called ahead to the others patrolling Jones' route and said he was in the clear. Just keep it under 130. An officer at my department pulled over a Tesla Model S last year. The guy was tearing out of a car show that's held in a parking lot every Friday. Officers like to hang out there to catch dummies doing dummy things like drag racing or peeling out at the light. It's an easy way to rack up some well-deserved tickets. And before Reddit downvotes me for saying that, keep in mind we recently had a motorcyclist and a pedestrian, 2 separate incidents, killed in this area for such behavior. Anyway, the officer didn't say anything about the driver's demeanor, but he did say that what drew his attention to the guy speeding was actually the sound of the car he was probably racing. The Tesla was ahead by a mile, but the other car was making all sorts of noise trying to catch up. Keep in mind we recently had a motorcyclist and a pedestrian, 2 separate incidents, killed in this area for such behavior. Seems like an awfully harsh punishment. My father was a police officer and he pulled over a half-track, the military vehicles that have both treads and tires. He said he asked the driver for license and registration because he couldn't believe it was street legal. Sure enough, he had a registration and it was 100% street legal with working directionals and brake lights. He said the driver was funny about owning and driving such an odd vehicle and completely understood being pulled over and checked. Police officers of Reddit, what was your "they could have gotten away with it if they had kept their mouth shut" moment? I had a car pass me once. Passenger hangs the upper half of his body out of the passenger side window with his middle finger in the air while screaming, "Frick the police." He had my attention for the seatbelt violation. I got behind the car and ran the registration. Registration is suspended. Registered owner's driver's license is attached to the registration and his license is suspended. Registered owner also has 2 warrants for retail theft. I stop the car, and they both started with the free speech thing and how I can't stop them for giving me the finger or swearing, which is 100% correct. When I pointed out that I can, however, stop them for the passenger not wearing a seatbelt and for the registration violation, suddenly they got quiet. Driver got arrested for suspended license and his warrants, and the passenger got himself a citation. The driver's vehicle got impounded. Moral of the story? Tell your passengers to shut their mouths. Had that guy not been a moron, his buddy would have been homeward bound. Lol. Like the Chris Rock video, how to not get your butt kicked by the police. Not a cop, but a public defender. Had a client who made a long statement that didn't help her case, but the judge was letting her go without setting bail. Before leaving the courtroom, however, I was informed that police from another precinct were coming to pick her up and she'd be held until they did. They didn't get her until much later, but I told her to absolutely not say anything to them, to keep her mouth shut. The next day I go to do her arraignment and I get the notice of any statements, which started with my lawyer told me not to say anything, but this is what happened. Admitted to a variety of crimes. It was frustrating to say the least. No a police officer, but I do know of this house in my local village that was a notorious drug den. The police came to search the place but couldn't find anything. As they were leaving, the lovely owner yelled at them that they should have brought the drug dogs. So yeah, they came back a few days later with the drug sniffing dogs and found huge amounts of drugs hidden away. Absolute morons. This one made me laugh. Not me, but my boyfriend. BF's working overnight when a guy comes through town doing 35 miles per hour in a 25 mile per hour. BF pulls the guy over and asks for his documentation, license, registration, insurance. Guy flips open his glove box, snatches his documents out and snaps the glove box closed super fast. BF laughs and says, "What do you have in there?" Guy gets a little sheepish and says, "You know, registration, insurance." Whispers, "Little bit of weed." End whisper. BF, "What?" Guy coughs and says, "Registration, insurance, and a little bit of weed." BF laughs again and says, "Seriously? Can I see?" Guy got a slap on the wrist for being honest and having a very small amount. I was the one that might have gotten away with it, but the cop pulled me over and says, "I clocked you going 86. Actually, I was going 85. I had the cruise control on. Yeah, that's still over the posted speed limit of 75 miles per hour. Oh, yeah, I guess it is. I know what I'm about, son. Don't try to tell me I was going faster." Currently watching Live PD, and the guy told the officer I have caffeine pills in my back pocket, gets them out, puts them on the hood. Everyone's chill. Dude then comes clean and says it's Molly, and the officers look at each other and go, "Do we even have a test kit for that?" Other officer says no. Dude's face just shows he should have kept his mouth shut. Not a police officer, but my mom once managed to talk her way into a lesser fine for a traffic offense, but wasn't satisfied with that, so managed to sass her way right back into the full fine. Sigh. Done that. Got to know when to hold and fold, and sometimes you learn that lesson the hard way. Okay, so we had a DUI accident where a guy kept driving straight into the woods into a tree because his GPS was predicting a future street. He walked back to his hotel room and left his check-in papers in the car. So we go to the hotel and go to his room and knock on the door. He did not have to answer, but he did. He was pretty clearly drunk. I asked him if he had anything to drink since the accident. He did not have to answer, or he could have told us that he drank after the accident. He said, "No, I haven't had anything to drink since the accident. And where I'm from you have 24 hours to report a property damage only accident. So it wasn't even a hit and run." So as I'm locking the guy up, he tells me he's a lawyer. I told him I hope you're not a defense attorney, but in his defense, he was drunk. Michael, there's no road here. A cousin of a friend of mine travels around the state to take in deadbeat dads. Gets to one place, a 4-year-old kid is home, dad isn't. So the cop starts talking to the kid, making sure he's okay and such. After a bit of this, kid says to cop, "Want to see my dad's secret garden?" Takes him to a closet with a false back, opens it up to see a small pot farm. Guy gets home to a few cop cars and a few charges. Good reason to not leave a 4-year-old home alone, I guess. I've had countless times where dudes give consent to search them or the vehicle and they end up having drugs. It baffles me why you would let me search if you don't have to, knowing there's some dang H in your Carl Mayo. Not a cop, but pretty applicable to the thread. When I was in high school, I liked to park in parking spots that cars had parked poorly next to just as a frick you. One time I was at a high school football game and a Jeep had parked like crap. He was nearly halfway into the spot next to him and parked at an angle. I was driving a 98 Fit Chevy Silverado, big old pickup truck, at the time, and I had my brother help guide me into the spot, so I was perfectly in the lines. That made it so the driver door was completely impossible to get in. I took a picture for the novelty of it and went on my way. When I got back to my car, the Jeep was gone and every panel on the passenger side of my car was keyed. There was an officer nearby, so I told him about it and showed him the picture. He told me there's not a lot they could do because there were no witnesses, but he'd give it a shot. He looked up their license plate, called them and asked them if they had done it. They confessed and ended up having to pay $1,600 in restitution along with getting a felony. Soul bro yo. Used to drive an old but Scottsdale Custom Deluxe and loved messing with crappy parking people. Not a cop either. Friend was pulled over for not wearing a seatbelt while he was with a few buddies. Gets handed his ticket. Guy in the backseat says, "Am I gonna get a ticket too?" Officer replies, "Well, were you wearing your seatbelt? UHH. Number. Alright. Can I see your ID?" Not the brightest fellow about. Hey, no fair. I want one too. Pull over this guy for expired tabs. Ask for his ID and he's feeling around for his wallet. Can't find it. He says, "Ah man, I'm one of you. It's cool." "Oh, what department?" "Oh, actually I'm a security guard, but same thing." I'm polite. "So where's your ID?" "Oh, it's in the," and he motions to the trunk. "It's in the trunk actually." "No, my BS radar is going off." "Okay, want to get you it out of the trunk?" "Nah, I don't have it." He starts looking around for another story to use, but now I know I'm supposed to stay out of the trunk. He's also not giving me any more information. "No ID. Then I have to take you in and get you fingerprinted. I'm going to get into that trunk one way or another." He's looking like he's lost. I ask him what's in the trunk, but he's not talking anymore. We pull him out and get him in cuffs. Another officer takes him to get it through fingerprints. Since his car is expired past 6 months California, we tow the car. In the process of getting ready to tow the car, we need to take a quick inventory. In the trunk was a police uniform with fake patches and a metal badge. No gun, but a duty belt. He also has stacks of child pee. This is a guy who a neighboring city had been looking for months. His MO was to dress as a police officer, talk to kids, and you can figure out the rest. If he just gave me his name, I could have looked up his ID and verified he had one. I'd probably have let him go. But honestly, I'm really happy about this one. Good on you, man. So this happened a few years ago. I was patrolling with my buddy at night. It was almost the end of our shift. Suddenly, we get an alert that a local nearby gas station had just been robbed, unsuccessfully, and that the suspect was supposed to pass by us in a red car. Indeed, seconds later we saw a man speeding through the road. Details on the side. We ended up courting him on a dead-end street. When my buddy was handcuffing the suspect, I asked the suspect if he had had something to do with the robbery. He repeatedly said, "I have never been there. Ask the ginger lady." Turns out the cashier that night was an old lady named Marcy, covering up for her ill daughter, whom would have never been able to identify him since he was wearing a black mask during the robbery, which we never found. Marcy had ginger hair. Fortunately, the suspect was kind enough to inadvertently confess the crime. How could he know the appearance of the cashier if he had never been at the crime scene? The jury thought the same. Fellow officer stopped a car for a turn violation. Guy is a wannabe drug dealer who we have seen around the bars before. We are talking with him and ask permission to search his car. He agrees. I'm bullshitting with him about sports and weather, and the officer finds a duffel bag. So I joke and say, "Nothing in there that's dangerous, right? Like bombs or grenades or explosives?" He nods and says, "Yeah, a bunch of dynamite." I'm waiting for him to laugh or smile or shrug or do something that screams it's a joke. Nothing. I say, "I'm going to open the bag and look." Okay, expecting at any moment he will stop me. He doesn't. It was 8 sticks of dynamite he stole from a construction site. Separate story. If he didn't say anything, I would have ignored the bag thinking it was tools. Some idiots from my hometown broke into a few houses in the early 2000s. Among several stolen items was a handheld video camera. They proceeded to record themselves breaking into several more houses and posing back home with their haul. Several of the items, including said camera, ended up at pawn shops. Well, when the batterer died, they didn't remove the tape. As is customary, the pawn shop found a compatible charger and watched the recordings. Copies of their fingerprints, IDs, and the video were turned into the police, and these morons went to jail. Almost everything from the videos was recovered from area pawn shops. I'm a nice guy, and I enjoy a chat. You'd be surprised how much this lowers someone's guard. Stood in full uniform. People will just start telling you things that could get them in trouble. Multiple times I had to tell people to shut up. It was usually petty things like where they hid their weed stash, that they'd got a bifter in their pocket for later. Not really worth the time and effort to deal with how skeezy we were. One time a guy really got himself in trouble by effectively telling me he had stolen property on him. I had to act on that one. Not a cop, but have a buddy that is. Nothing too crazy, but he's had countless moments where he's tried to give people a break, or all they had to do was sit down and be quiet, but they end up talking themselves into jail. Recently had a dude he pulled over that was a bit over the limit, but not too much, so he was gonna let a friend pick him up instead of arresting him. Guy got to talking and basically revealed driving under the influence was something he did fairly regularly. A single mistake is one thing, but my buddy decided the best chance at getting him to stop would be learning this lesson the hard way. Not a cop. I had a roommate in college that was no friend of mine. He got in a fight at a bar and was kicked out. He tried to go back into the bar and got thrown out again, but a cop happened to be driving by the second time. Cop told him to relax or he was going to be arrested. He told the cop to arrest him. Cop handcuffs him and puts him in the back of the cop car. Roommate then started banging on the window. Cop then recuffed him with his hands behind his back. Roommate's stupidity carried on for the next couple months. He was supposed to go to court over the whole thing, but didn't show up. Police showed up at his job, cuffed him and brought him to court. Judge told him he would have just received a slap on the wrist, but he now had to send him to jail for a couple days. He was scheduled to report to jail a week or two later, and he didn't show up for that either. By this time, he disappeared. I never saw the guy again. Not a cop, but a witness. During college, my friends and I would hang out outside and smoke hookah. Frequently we would invite strangers who passed by to join, or campus police would casually chat with us as they made their rounds. So one time a group of freshmen walked past and asked to join. After about 15 minutes the campus police car rolls up and the freshmen get visibly nervous. We tell them calm down. The cops are chill. As soon as the cop gets out of the car, one freshman bolts and makes it about 20 feet before the cop tackles him. We all clap and heckle the kid. Upon searching him, the cop finds a bunch of weed. Then he says, "You realize prior to running, I had no reason to be suspicious. I just wanted to talk to my friends over there," and points at us. The cop ends up writing a ticket and sends him off. Last night, a dude had a gun inside his house. I asked if the gun was stolen. He said I'm not sure. I asked if I could run the serial number. He gives me the shotgun. Comes back stolen from a department store. He was arrested for possession of a stolen firearm. All he had to do was say no. I had no other reason than consent. He wouldn't have gotten away with it, but a patron of the bar that my sister worked at many years ago was stopped by the troopers while driving along next to the highway, in the ditch. His explanation: "Officer, I'm way too drunk to be on the road." I said it was profiling. Turns out they were arresting everyone driving on the sidewalk that particular night. Ron White. This situation came from a friend of mine. So he lived with 3 other guys in a 4-bedroom apartment. One day when only one roommate was home, the police came knocking. They asked if they could come in and search for suspected drug use. Here is where I should mention the roommate who was home was kind of an oblivious shoot-in who spent most of his day playing WoW Magic the Gathering in his room. So of course he says sure, come on in, having no idea what his roommates have been up to. In room 1 they find nothing, as that was the oblivious guy's room. Room 2 they find a personal amount bag of weed. Room 3 they find a pipe. Roommate 3 didn't smoke, but he and RM2 played video games a lot, so it belonged to RM2. In room 4 they find a possession with intent to distribute giant bag of weed. Apparently just a shitload. RM2 told me it was the most weed he'd ever seen in one place, and he was peeved because he always bought from someone else. Didn't know his roommate was a dealer. 3 of the 4 get arrested. Only one who didn't was the guy who let them in. My friend was roommate 3. Charges against him got dropped because RM2 fessed up to the pipe being his and got a slap on the wrist. Not sure what happened to RM4. They never saw him again. Not me but my dad. My dad was in an army helicopter unit assigned to local police to search for marijuana plants being grown in the rural parts of my state in the 1980s. One day, they found a decently sized gaggle of marijuana plants located just off the property of a farm. They landed the helicopter on the farm and talked to the farmer, asking him if he knew that someone was growing weed near his property. The farmer got scared and immediately confessed that they were his plants. He was arrested by the police. Oddly enough, if the farmer would have played dumb, the army and the police were just going to remove the weed and leave. While I was in field training, I was investigating a hit and run. A lady parked her car on the street in front of her house and found it all smashed up the next morning. My field training officer was like, "Yeah, these usually are hard to solve unless there's video footage or we find a smashed up car nearby." We were wrapping up and about to leave when this woman walked up to my window of the squad car and was like, "I did that. I was coming back to say I was sorry. Case closed." She got a ticket instead of being arrested because I appreciated her honesty. She probably avoided a DUI by leaving the scene the previous evening. She said she had left her friend's house at about 3 AM and she couldn't provide an explanation for why she slammed into a parked car on a residential street. This isn't necessarily being stupid though. This is knowingly choosing to confess. This is going to be buried but it's funny, so here. I was a cop on an Air Force base in Alaska. 3 guys robbed our Class 6 store, liquor, and we responded to the store but got caught in traffic at a light on the way. So we were sitting there with lights and sirens on trying to get people to move out of the way when the back door to the car ahead of us opens and a guy gets out and goes spread eagle against his trunk. Confused, we get out to see what was up and realize that these were the robbers. "Hey chief, we got what?" A friend told me a story about when he and his teenage friends had a crappy garage band. They were jamming one night and some family member gets into it with her boyfriend in the house. Cops were called. They stopped playing and go outside to watch. A cop walked over to them to find out who they were. One kid straight up admitted that he had been drinking that night. Because that wasn't what the cops were there for and he didn't see anyone drinking. He said he didn't care. The kid took that as permission, walked into the garage and walked back out with his beer. Now the cop cared enough to take him to jail. Absolutely never admit to any crime without a lawyer present. Just because you know you did it and the cops know you did it doesn't mean it'll hold up in court or that they'll think it's worth the time to prosecute it. You don't need them to think you're a good guy who made an understandable mistake. You need to stay out of a cage. Keep your mouth shut. The only word you should be saying is lawyer. Obviously not a scientific sample, but if you watch the first 48 hours, everyone who declines a lawyer and tries to talk their way out of it ends up in jail. Almost everyone who gets a lawyer and exercises their Fifth Amendment rights walks out the front door as the cops say, "We know this guy did it. We just can't prove it enough to take it to court." Not a cop but was part of a jury. This guy is being questioned about a rape and he tells the officer that it's all balls just like the thing 10 years ago. His ex-wife is just a lying bee trying to get him in trouble. Cop starts looking into his record from 10 years ago and finds out he was under suspicion for another rape but left town before he could be questioned, so it got put aside. That prosecutor retired and it was forgotten. New cop takes it to the prosecutor and they reopened that case. We convicted him on all counts and he got 25 years in prison, and the new case I believe he plead guilty since he's already facing the rest of his life in prison. Had he kept his mouth shut they wouldn't have ever looked that far back. Now he will probably never leave prison. I'm a police officer in the UK. It was about 2 AM, which meant street lights were off. As I was patrolling, I saw a vehicle drive with only his side lights on, spun around, pulled them over. I asked for his license and it's a provisional. His co-pilot was 20 and didn't have a license and the vehicle didn't have L plates. This means he's driving otherwise than in accordance of his license and also driving with no insurance, because as if he did have any insurance, driving otherwise than in accordance normally invalidates it. So, I got him in the back of my car to speak to him, start writing out a traffic ticket for no insurance, and was going to seize the car and let him off for driving otherwise in accordance. However, as I am writing the ticket, he says to me I shouldn't even be driving this car. My mate doesn't even know I took it. I just kinda pause. I'm sorry, what? Yeah, my mate lives just up the road and I was round his. He fell asleep, so I thought I'd just take the car and go for a ride. Right. I get another unit to go to the address, and the suspect's friend confirms he's not happy for him to be having the car, especially now that it's being seized. So now, instead of 6 points and a £200 fine and a P-off friend, he gets nicked for twalk, taking a vehicle without the owner's consent, driving otherwise than in accordance with his license, and for no insurance. He's been to court and received 6 points and just shy of £1,000 in fines and costs, as well as a P-off mate, and spent a night in a cell. Former cop here. We always had a statement that we used if we ever got in trouble, and it applies to anyone. No poly, no waiver, no statement. Basically, never consent to take a polygraph. Never waive your rights and never make a statement. You may think you're doing yourself a favor by answering questions and trying to be helpful, but more often than not you'll end up digging your own grave. Be polite about it, but respectfully refuse anything until you've spoken to a lawyer. Never consent to take a polygraph. My dad is a decades experienced criminal defense lawyer and a former judge, and he told me this: when the cops think you're guilty, a polygraph has two outcomes: lying or inconclusive. Never take a polygraph, ever. It's not a show of innocence, it's an invitation for someone to tell you they officially can't tell if you're lying or not. Like this video and this good boy will play you a nice song. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video, or don't. Either way, have a great day, you magnificent people.